Okay, sorry for the slight delay. All right, today we're going to continue on with our discussion about perception. Before we do, something just happened in my other class, the one before yours, I want to talk about for a minute. I always assume that, when I give these lectures, people are at their computers listening, but I called on students, and my impression was that maybe a third are actually participating, actually at the computer, and the rest aren't. Is I'm not sure how to react to that, other than why do people take a class like this? Is simply to get the degree? Do you want to be honest with me? Like you're here mainly just to get your ticket stamped and move on. Is that accurate? It's okay to be honest. I mean,
I don't think so, Professor. I think people are in this class to learn something.
okay, yeah, I think you probably are, but not everybody. I mean, 100% is probably not true, but I don't know what to do about this, because like I usually, and this with you guys, I called on people last time and a lot answered, but in that class I called on like 5 or 6 people, and none of them apparently were listening. And it just I don't know if there's anything I can do with it. In this kind of circumstance, a lot of it depends on the good faith. I take attendance, which is probably the right thing, just because you want to be able to say you at least did something. But the thing is, maybe I'm thinking, if you have any thoughts on it, let me know. It's pointless to push it now, but maybe I've been going about it the wrong way. But I'm thinking anyway. I don't know if I have the answer. So in any case, let's get started today. I wanted to, we're going to talk about Rashomon later. And I did call on some people, hopefully I'll do that. We'll have time for that. I wanted to finish up the stuff on perception and ethics. And in the other section, what did I do with my notes? In the other section, I was talking a little bit about ethical theory and just giving some broad overview. But I also want to talk about some of the biases. We already talked about self-serving bias, and that just means that people tend to attribute ambiguous information positively, and to reject negative feedback, and to want to hear information about themselves that's, affirming of their self-concept. We all have that. Fundamental attribution error, I said last time, is that we tend to underestimate the influence of external factors and overestimate the importance of internal factors. So someone in the other class said, well, in the case of shooting, external factors might be the availability of guns, whereas internal factors may be the individual who chose to do the shooting. And we tend to overestimate the importance of the individual and underestimate the importance of the situation. It may also be, let's say, there is a gun control law in effect, then maybe it's the reverse, that the situation led to a certain outcome that and we blame it on the individual. So anyway, fundamental attribution error is the idea that we tend to underestimate the influence of external factors, i.e. the environment, and we tend to underestimate internal factors. Basically, we all take shortcuts in evaluating others, and this gets to stuff like selective perception, which means that we don't see everything in the environment. And that may be because of our own personal prejudice, that we look for confirmation of our assumptions, but it could also just mean that we're not able to perceive it, that we want to perceive it, but we just are not able to. For example, in coming up with a solution to a physics problem, like in that movie I was talking about black holes, they're looking for a solution and they can't find it, and it's probably there, but they don't see it. Okay, and the reason they don't see it is that they're blocked. So basically, selective perception means that we often can't see what's in the environment, and sometimes it requires a great deal of thought. Sometimes some jarring event will shift our perception a little. And if you look at the really creative people in history, they may have something slightly different about them that enables them to see things in a slightly different way, and so perceive things that other people can't perceive. And I also think I mentioned the idea of halo and horn effects, that in interviewing others or giving a performance appraisal, we will often focus on one characteristic and either draw a conclusion that we like the person or we don't like the person based on that one characteristic. Oh, I agree with you about politics, therefore you're okay. Or you like the same ball team I like, you're okay. Or you have an opinion that I find objectionable, then everything you do is wrong. Or I don't like your style of dress, maybe you're too sloppy or something like that. So everything you do, you're not productive, you're not, so basically our opinions are all biased by certain things, certain triggers. And there are also contrast effects and stereotypes. So in other words, if somebody stands out in a group, we might draw a much stronger opinion about them, even though in the scheme of things, they're not that exceptional. For example, if you have a work team that's below average and one person is really good, they may seem spectacular, but in reality, they're just average because everybody else is below average. They look really good. Stereotyping means that we tend to overgeneralize, or you have a past experience, or we have some assumption about a category, and we draw conclusions based on that general category. Interviewers will often make their final decision based on the first tenth of a second. So early impressions become entrenched and are far more important than an objective assessment of the individual. Performance expectations. Somebody asked last time, how do you overcome biases in performance expectations that people might have of you? And my answer is that you need to have very clear goals. You need to have a vision of what it is you're trying to achieve. You need to be persistent. And some of the things I'm talking about, like goal setting, are going to play a big role in that. Common biases that people have, and a guy at Harvard University, I think it's Harvard Business School, named Max Bazerman, has written a lot about this, that there's a whole host of perceptual biases that distort our thinking. We're often overconfident. We tend to anchor our decisions in a past bit of information. So we the tendency, which is now illegal in New York, that people used to ask, what's your current salary? And they would base a job offer on your current salary, even though your productivity on the new job might be completely different. It's kind of like if there's an actor who has a small role and then is recognized and is offered a starring role in a subsequent movie, they don't base the compensation for the starring role on what the actor got in the small role, because the productivity rate is much higher in the starring role. So it can't have the same compensation. A big bias is escalation of commitment. There's a fundamental fallacy called sunk costs, that once we invest in something, whether or not we should continue to invest in it depends on the future. It doesn't depend on that we've already invested in it. So let's say we invest in a company and then the market changes, or we find out information we didn't know about, or something along those lines. And so we reassess and then say, what do you do? The fallacy of sunk costs is that you would keep investing in it to try to get something back. But in reality, what you really should do is take the investment that remains and put it into something that's more productive. So you should put your investment in the thing that is going to work the best. And this idea of escalation of commitment is often seen in politics. We saw it in the Vietnam War, for example, that because we've been fighting for so long, we need to keep fighting. And this is a mistake. If you realize that a course of action was mistaken, it pays to cut your losses and then move your attention elsewhere, move your investment elsewhere. People are also driven by the scarcity of information, that if they have some information available, they will base their decisions on that. And hindsight bias it's easy to make a decision after events have occurred. You say, oh, if I were there, I would have made this decision. But in fact, you're not in that position. Social media, and I would say mass media, is a huge source of bias. We are all very suggestible, and basically, when we hear things in the news, whether it's television or social media or whatever, it tends to bias our thinking, and we're all susceptible to these biases. So we need to always ask ourselves, is what I'm hearing from the sources I'm relying on, how true is that? And often checking and asking is a wise move. I think I started talking about last time about Graham Allison, and he wrote this book, Essence of Decision, back in the 70s, and it was about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And basically, he talks about 3 models of decision making, and this is like the whole substance of the criticism that psychologists and organizational behavior has of economic thinking. And it's not to say that economics is wrong. It's right. I think I would say economics is right. But the problem is that in the practical world, decisions aren't usually made that way. So I think the model of economics that actors try to optimize their net present value is ideal, but often not empirically observable. And so basically, Allison talks about 3 ways to interpret how the interaction, and you're going to hear about the Cuban Missile Crisis when you watch the movie The Fog of War, because McNamara, that was one of the main things McNamara did, was he was involved with that. And basically what Allison says is that you could view the choices that Kennedy made as optimal, and I think it's one of the few decisions in post-World War II American history that actually could be described as having been made optimally. Basically, Kennedy chose to negotiate with Khrushchev, and this avoided nuclear holocaust. That's the idea of the rational actor model, that you maximize your net present value. I like to tell my students, there's a book by a guy named Andrew Dubrin in the 1990s called Winning Office Politics, a guide for the 90s. And he said that there are 3 basic decision making, I'll put them on criteria. Okay, the first one, net present value, just means the present value of returns on an investment subtracted from minus the initial investment. So you take the sum of the cash flows that you receive from the investment, and then you subtract the cash you're putting into the investment. And that gives you the net present value. The ROI, of course, means that you compute the return on an investment over time. So, for example, if the stock market's going up 10% and the dividend rate is 2%, then an investment in the market each year is 12%. That's your return on investment. The third one is a little more complicated, PPB, and this is his main point. It stands for President's Pet Project. Okay, and what he's saying is that if the president wants you to do something, throw out NPV and ROI and do what the president says. By president, I mean the president of a corporation. So if you work in a corporation and the president says to you, I want you to do this, and you look at it and you say to them, yeah, but the net present value of that project is below some other project. It's really not the way to win them over. Instead, what you want to do is just do what they say and accept that the decision was made politically. And that's what Dubrin characterizes as the political decision-making model. And it's always there. I could give you millions of examples from my own career as to just as one. I forgot if I mentioned it in this class, was when I computed the value of the auto fleet in Albany when I was working for the state assembly. I talked to some experts in it, and basically what they said was use a rational actor model, that you take the amortized cost of the cars, and if that's less than the ongoing repairs because the fleet has become too old, you replace the fleet. However, the politicians felt that if the state employees are driving around in new cars, some of the voters will get annoyed. So better to have old cars, even if it's more expensive. Okay, so basically, that's a political decision-making model. And the more that you remove markets from the constraints an organization faces, the more political the decisions are going to be made. So basically, if you're a large corporation that doesn't face a lot of competition, let's say a Johnson & Johnson, that place was far more political than the mining company I worked for. And the least political would be like an entrepreneurial startup. Okay, you're just worried about getting results. In contrast, when I worked in Albany, it was pure politics. There's very, very little concern for efficiency. So basically, the political model is often the most realistic, but I think the bounded rationality model is also a very important critique of the rational actor model. And as I say, in the long run, in a market economy, corporations that don't abide by the rational actor model will cease to exist. And I think we mentioned Enron as an example of that. The recent one, Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX, another example. And there's countless examples of firms that fail to satisfy the market and then go out of existence. What the bounded rationality model says is that may be so, but we often don't know what the market wants, and we often don't know what kind of decision is optimal. And this idea was first put forward by two scholars, James March and Herbert Simon, in the 1950s in a book called Organizations. And I highly recommend this book. It's very rigorous and difficult, but worth reading. And they catalog how rationality is constrained. And there are numerous ways. We often don't think of an optimal solution, for example, or we don't know what the future returns on an investment will be. and we don't know what we don't know. So basically, what March and Simon said is that firms often make decisions based on what they call a satisficing approach, that rather than trying to optimize a solution, find the optimal solution, find the lowest cost approach or the most profitable investment, what they do is they look for an investment that's good enough. And so they set a criterion and they say, for example, 15% return. And anything that goes above that is then a fair game for investment. But let's say if they search extensively, they might find an investment that blows everything else out of the water, that has a 300% return instead of a 20% return. But it may require much more search costs than they're willing to invest. And they don't really know what will result from all those search costs. They don't know in the future what those search costs will bring. So the result is that decisions are often being made based on constrained rationality. And so if you observe how firms actually function, it's often using rule of thumb decision rules rather than searching for optimal solutions. And the point is that a lot of the economics that is taught isn't observable in the real world. Both are true. So, for example, firms that don't behave optimally or close to optimally are likely to find themselves swamped by their competitors. On the other hand, it's often unrealistic to behave rationally. So both are true. So, for example, if you worked in the car industry in America in the 1950s, and you tried to argue that the car companies should improve quality and improve their production processes and focus less on office politics, you probably would have been fired. But in fact, that was true. And then what happened was that Japanese car makers did behave optimally and focused on lean manufacturing and total quality management, and then displaced the dominance of the US car makers. So, you know, what once was virtually a monopoly of the big three, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, was completely overturned by Toyota and Honda and Subaru, and they then, in many cases, became better selling cars than the US cars. So basically, the car companies abided by the bounded rationality model and probably the political model, but they ended up losing a lot of market share as a result. So this is my point, that to behave rationally is what makes you successful, but in the real world, very few do, and in government, nobody does. Okay, so, or almost nobody. You know, again, the Kennedy example with the Cuban Missile Crisis was an optimal choice. But if you look at, you know, and we look at Robert McNamara in a few weeks, he perceives himself as being a genius. And, you know, again, this is self-serving bias. But the truth is that he instituted a large emphasis on statistical decision-making rules into the military, which on paper sound efficient, but actually resulted in absurd kinds of decision-making, including a lot of what was done in Vietnam. And these absurd decision rules had a detrimental effect. And yet he could still be unashamed of them, because the milieu in which the army exists is not a market setting, so it doesn't get punished for stupidity. Of course, it gets punished because it loses wars or makes stupid decisions, like they've done repeatedly, but somehow that doesn't seem to trouble political leaders. They can always invent a story and blame somebody else or something like that. Okay, so basically, then, based on all I've said, it's not surprising then that our decision making is influenced heavily by our perceptions, which in turn are influenced heavily by things like our personality. So, if you recall, when I talked about the big five personality traits, I said there were five of them: neuroticism, extroversion, openness, agreeability, and conscientiousness. And openness refers to how open to new experiences you are. And I said that people who have a lot of openness are willing to try new things. So basically, people who are high on openness have less self-serving bias. And so that might contribute to better decision-making. It turns out that intellectual ability is a mixed bag, that people who do well on intellectual ability measures are still going to suffer from self-serving bias and overconfidence. But intellectual ability is associated with greater mental flexibility, being able to change your viewpoint, and selecting appropriate decision-making strategies. So intellectual ability, again, is a mixed bag. Cultural and gender differences exist. Males tend to be more prone to risk-taking and sensation-seeking, and basically as well, cultures differ in time orientation. So different cultures are going to think in long-term ways differently from other cultures. So basically, one, I think, shortcoming of our culture is that we tend to think short-term. And a lot of that, I might show you a video of Deming. Deming was talking about this in the 80s, and it's been well known for many, many decades that the stock market fluctuations drive a lot of what executives think, because they are rewarded based on these short-term fluctuations. Okay, so I'm going to take a break for a second and take attendance, which I hadn't done yet. So we've got, everyone's come in, and okay, Farhad Abdul.
Yeah, I'm here.
Farhad. Ahmed Alcor.
I'm here.
Hello. Mohammed Afi. Mohammed. Jenna Bell.
I'm here.
Hello. Joseph Catanzaro.
Yeah, Professor, I'm here.
Jimin Chen.
I'm here.
Hi, Jimin. Janine Cola. Janine. Kermia Cyrus.
I'm here, Professor.
Hello. David Estorovsky.
I'm here.
Hello. Marimar Garcia.
Here.
Hello. Monica Garcia.
Here.
Hello. Alexia Harrigan.
Here.
Hello. Kani Jiang.
Here.
Hello. Yusuf Kahan.
I'm here.
Hello. Georgie Karimashvili.
Here.
Hello.
I'm here.
Hello. Summer Lamb. Summer. Hangjian Lin.
Here.
Hello. Hamdi Mally.
Here.
Ludley Noel.
Here.
Ludley?
Here.
How you doing? Famita Petwari.
Here.
Hello. Emmanuel Plamakis.
Here.
Hello. Raquel Porteous. Raquel. Ji Shan Ruan.
Hi, Professor, I'm here.
Hello. Brendan Samuel.
Hello, Professor, I'm here.
Hello. Aaliyah Todd.
Hello, Professor. I'm here.
Hello, Aaliyah. Stacy Ergiles.
Hello, I'm here.
Stacy. Denasia Warner. Denasia. Okay. Jack.
Good morning, Professor. I'm here.
Hello. Yayin Zhang.
Hi, Professor. I'm here.
Yeah. I'm sorry, Yixuan Zhang.
I'm here, Professor.
Hello. Matthew Zhao.
Here, Professor.
Hello. Taryn.
Hi, I'm here.
Taryn. Christian.
Good morning, Professor.
Morning. Janaya.
Good morning, Professor. I'm here.
Janaya. Alexander.
Hi, I'm here.
Hi, Alexander. Jack Shrem.
Hi, Professor. Good morning.
Morning. I'm going to call the people who didn't answer the first time. Mohammed Athi. Summer Lamb.
I'm here. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. Raquel Porteous. Denasia Warner. Okay, those are all here. Okay, so let me finish this material up. I also want to talk about ethics. If we run out of time, we can continue Rashomon into next time. So basically, adding to the discussion of decision making, there are a lot of organizational constraints. I already mentioned compensation, and basically years ago, a guy named Steve Kerr, who's not the football coach, it's a different guy, wrote an article about the title of it was the failure of rewarding, no, the folly, I'm sorry, the folly of rewarding A and hoping for B. So basically what Steve argued was that if you just to take an example from my own profession, if you reward research by giving people tenure if they publish X number of articles, let's say you have 5 years, in most places 7 years, to publish 5 articles, and if you do, you get tenure. That's how it works. Some places it might be 15 articles. And sometimes they say you have to publish in certain journals, so stuff like that, and they can up the ante indefinitely. At Harvard, I think they go beyond that, and they kind of say, well, you have to become well known or something. So most people don't get tenure there, but basically, if you focus on stuff like that and don't reward teaching, then the professors will focus on the research and not do the teaching. And then the dean says, well, how come no one ever teaches here? And you can find this in industry, like the same with salesmen. If you pay by commission and you say, I'm going to reward new sales, don't expect them to spend a lot of time on customer service. So basically, the idea that people are going to do the right thing in all circumstances. The title of Steve's article is that it's folly, and he gives a lot of examples of it. This, incidentally, is a very different perspective from a lot of OB discussion of decision making and management. A lot of people argue that, well, for example, the Human Relations School argued that money doesn't matter, that what matters is group norms. And the job redesign school that was started by Hertzberg, and we'll talk about the job characteristics model when we talk about motivation. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, the interest level of work does motivate, but it's also true that money motivates. The mistake that a lot of the management literature makes is that they assume it's an either or. And part of the reason is that the nature of empirical research in social sciences is that it abstracts a couple of things, and that becomes the focus of the claim. But in the broader context, money matters. There's this whole literature. This guy Alfie Kohn wrote a book. He's written a number of books, and it gets a lot of attention. And there are a number of these people. It's not just him. He wrote a book called "Punished by Rewards," and he argues that rewards are demotivating. There's a guy named Deci who makes similar arguments, and others. And the thing is, the way they prove this is like ridiculous. They use monkeys to experiment. They do experiments on monkeys. And so they, like, if the monkey solves the problem, they give them a banana, or they treat solving the problem as a game. And if they treat the problem as a game, then the monkey solves it better than if you give them a banana. The thing is that we're not monkeys, let's face it. A banana is not going to motivate me too much. But basically, people go to work because they're paid. So this creates what's called cognitive dissonance. And if you do a study and don't include that initial point, the whole study is nonsense. And their entire research body is based on that kind of nonsense. So basically, we all go to work for money. Not all, but I would say 99.9% of the population would not work if they weren't paid. There are some people who, like, they have money at home, they already have money and they're doing work for social reasons and stuff, or Mother Teresa or whatever. There are such people, but in general, we're mostly going to go to work because we're paid. If we're not paid, we're not going to go. And so, money is an important factor, and it's going to influence how we make decisions. And if we're rewarded for a certain kind of decision, then we're going to do that. And that's going to be true, pretty much across the board. As well, rules, formal regulations, time constraints, and the culture of the organization are all going to affect how we make decisions. And the last one, the history and culture of the organization, is incredibly important. Basically, the example I like to use is that of A&P supermarkets. Most of you probably never even heard of it. There's a chain, I think it's still around, called Food Emporium, that was a spin-off of them. But basically, A&P was the largest supermarket chain in America into the 1970s, I believe, and was the largest retailer in America for many decades. And they were even subject to an antitrust suit by the Justice Department in the 1940s, the claim being that they were too big. Yet today, you've not even heard of them. And the reason is that their history and culture prevented them from making the transition to compete with the big box retailers. First Kmart, then Walmart, and Walmart then overcame Kmart, which no longer exists basically, as far as I know, or it's greatly diminished. But A&P was just not able to compete with them, and it gradually shrunk in size until it disappeared. And the reason they couldn't bring themselves to compete with them was not that they didn't know what to do. In fact, they had pioneered a big box discount store in Jersey City. They were a New York City company. They had pioneered a big box discount store in Jersey City in the 1950s. And they had the expertise, but they just couldn't bring themselves to shift from the model of the modern supermarket. The irony, though, is that their use of the modern supermarket had been that very type of decision. They shifted their culture radically in the 1920s. They had been founded in I think it was around 1850, and there had been only 2 generations. The founders were named Gilman and Hartford, and I think the Hartford heirs ran the company into the 1950s. There were just 2 generations, and they were very innovative. And the firm started out as a chain of coffee shops, like selling tea, dry tea and coffee, along with some groceries. And it was a small store. This was before the supermarket. When the supermarket was invented, they saw it as a competitive opportunity, and they totally transformed themselves into a supermarket, so that the leadership was able to radically change the culture. But after they died, the people who inherited the management were unable to shift the culture. They didn't have the ability or the vision. And so they just didn't compete. They continued on as an ordinary supermarket and couldn't compete, and they eventually died. So basically, and this is true, you see this many, many instances, something like 20% of the Fortune 500 in 1950 still exists in its current form. I'm going to check that fact. That still exists. I think it's about 20%. Okay, well, here's a good statistic. I was wrong. It's smaller. It said only 10% of the Fortune 500 in 1955 still exist in its current form. So that means all these other companies, so that means 450 of the Fortune 500 were either bought out by other people or went bankrupt in the last 65 years. And that is due to failure to innovate because of the constraints of organizational culture, as well as just having been bought out. A lot of them were just bought up by bigger companies. So basically, this is often a very big problem. Now, just to summarize what I've been talking about, your book talks about a few steps to rational decision-making, and this is what your model should be when you make a decision. First of all, to define the problem. Second of all, to identify decision criteria, how much you weight the criteria, which one is most important. And you could do that numerically. You could say, this is 80% of the problem, this is 10%, and that's 3%. You could identify the decision criteria, give it weights, and give it alternatives. You then evaluate the alternatives, select the best one, and then implement the decision and follow up by monitoring. Although, as I say, although this is an ideal model, there are a lot of constraints on rationality, defining the problem accurately, identifying the decision criteria accurately. And so we can't often follow it, but the ideal is to follow it. Okay, so that said, I'm going to move now into a discussion of ethics, which interestingly, your book bundles with perception. And your book talks about 3 criteria in ethical decision-making. I don't think that's true. I would say it's partially true, but there are other approaches to ethics than the 3 they talk about. In particular, virtue ethics, I would say is the best model, and they kind of don't mention it. But in any case, the 3 criteria are utilitarianism, deonance or deontology, and legally derived rights. And utilitarianism just means, another word for it is consequentialism. And it just means that you base the ethics of the decision on what you accomplish by doing it. For example, the classic statement of utilitarianism is the greatest good for the greatest number. So if you make a decision based on the greatest good for the greatest number, you're being ethical. The second one is based on duty. So there are certain rules or duties that we all have. And the idea is that if we abide by them, we're being ethical. For example, I feel like my duty is to try to teach as well as I can. So I have a duty, I feel like I have a duty to do that. And I spend more time on it than other people might think is rational, but I do it because I feel it's my duty. And, the classic statement, of course, the 10 Commandments or, the law. I mean, the law, we all have to obey the law. And that's, we have the duty to obey the law. Now, these two are often in conflict. For example, it could be, let's say you could save the world by killing one person. Like, let's say you had, you could travel back in the future and back into the past, I mean, and you could travel back to 1930, and you knew that if you could kill Adolf Hitler, you would save, I think the number who died in World War II was about 80 million people. And if you killed Adolf Hitler, you could save the lives of 80 million people. Would it be ethical to kill Adolf Hitler? Well, it's debatable, because the duty of not murdering somebody is extremely grave. It's grave and important. And so is it ever moral to kill somebody? Now, the utilitarians would say yes. And that's a kind of an easy one, because you might say, well, the utilitarian value of getting rid of Hitler before he started, invading Czechoslovakia and Poland, the gain from getting rid of him and saving all those people is so huge that even a staunch devotee of duty-based ethics would say, yeah, well, maybe I'll make an exception. But like, you could also say, there've been movies. There was one with Gene Hackman, I forget the title of it, where this like mad scientist is like experimenting on homeless people in order to create a cure for chronic illness. And he kills a lot of homeless people to find this cure. Now, is that ethical? Now, I think most people would say no, but it could well be that you could argue that you're creating the greatest good for the greatest number. So I'm not claiming to solve any of these questions. I'm just sort of outlining some issues there. And the final category is legally defined rights. And this would be this refers to the debate between negative rights and positive rights. that, in other words, between what you might call liberals and advocates of state activism. When I use the word liberal, what I mean is people who don't believe in state activism. Today, in America, it's often used to mean state activism, but the traditional meaning, and I think the clean meaning, is that liberalism means that you're free of the state. Your liberal means free, liberty. So basically, advocates of negative rights say the state should not impose on people, and if the state either taxes me or forces me to do something I wouldn't otherwise do, that is inherently undesirable, because freedom is an end in itself. A liberal would put a lot of weight on freedom as a terminal value. In contrast, advocates of positive rights diminish the importance of freedom and say the state should compel people to do things that it wants in order to guarantee certain legally derived rights to other people. So, for example, healthcare or Social Security, that people have a right to a retirement pension and they have a right to healthcare. So it's okay to curtail everyone's freedom to guarantee these other rights. Okay, so I'm not claiming that I'm going to resolve that debate today, but you should be aware that there is such a debate. So in other words, you could view it. I drew this in my other class, in one of my real-time classes. You can view like ethical preferences as a kind of indifference curve, and different people, I'm showing this on the whiteboard, different people have different preferences. And so I think it's wrong to say there's any one right answer. A lot of people think there is, but again, this is, it's kind of like the self-serving bias that we think our own opinions are the right ones. And, you could view it as an indifference curve, like a trade-off curve that they use in economics. So on the y-axis, you could say people who believe in positive rights, such as security, safety, quality. And on the x-axis, you could say there are people who believe in negative rights, such as freedom or individualism. And there's always going to be trade-offs in society. So, if you're like up here, like on the security and equality end of the curve, you might be in Europe, like in Belgium or France, where there's relatively high taxes, there's a lot of state intervention, everybody's treated the same. It's hard to start a business. People who, in France, if you work more than 35 hours a week, you could get arrested. Basically, there's a lot of weight put on homogeneity, security, and equality. Whereas to some degree, I'm not saying it's absolute, but we still have to some degree, a greater degree in this country of freedom and individualism, where mandates are fewer, taxes are lower, there's less equality, and there's more individual choice. So, for example, if you go to Belgium, the tax receipts of the government there are about half of the gross domestic product. So that means that everyone's income halfway goes to the government, and then you get a lot of free stuff in exchange. So your freedom is curtailed because you can't say, I don't want to go to school, I want to start a business. You can't say that. In other words, your money's going to school, whether you choose it or not. And so which one is right? There's no right answer. You could add incidentally to this one, let's say it's hard to work with this thing. You could add to this one, let's say collectivism. And to this one, you could add opportunity. You know, so different countries have different trade-offs, and the reason is that they have different moral values. Some put more weight on legally derived rights, some put more weight on individual rights and liberty. So basically, if we look at the history of the philosophical interpretations of these ethical viewpoints, Descartes argued that our ethical values are legitimate and our perceptions of ethics can be rational, and our perceptions are real because God guarantees the accuracy of our perceptions. That's the argument, the Cartesian argument, that our perceptions are real and rational. Hume then tore this apart later on. You know, there's a long gap between Descartes and Hume, a couple hundred years, but Descartes lived in the 1500s, and the years Descartes lived. So Descartes lived in really 1600, so it's more like 120 years between Descartes and Hume. Hume lived in the late 18th century, and Hume basically argued that our assumptions about reality are biologically driven and have no rational basis. So nothing is knowable because cause and effect is an illusion. He doesn't talk about where it comes from, but I'm suggesting that it has an evolutionary source, that it's that the reason we can think in terms of cause and effect is that doing so enables us to survive, which may be evidence that it's real, but Hume said that there's no rational foundation for cause and effect, that these are illusory concepts. And I think he makes convincing arguments that not that it's not there, but that we can't know it through reason. We can't prove it. And he also made the same kind of argument about ethics and argued that ethics is emotion and not reason. And when I first read that stuff, I said to myself, that must mean that ethics is unimportant because it's not reason. But that's not really true. I mean, emotions are important. So basically, just because something's emotional doesn't mean it's unimportant. It can be more important. So basically, what he's saying is that the aims of people like Thomas Aquinas and others to derive a rationally based ethic is delusional, but that our ethics drive a lot of what we do through our emotional makeup. And we don't really know it, we feel it. Kant tried to respond to that by saying that our rational framework serves as a foundation for what we can say is universal human experience. So although we can't know the thing in itself is the term he used, the underlying reality, we can't know that. What we know is what our perceptions are, and these are guided by universal principles that we all share. So the implication is, because we don't know the thing in itself, it's pointless to, ponder it, but rather that humanity shares a certain conceptual makeup, and that cause and effect is comprehensible through this framework of rationality, the categories of reason. And he says that there are 12 categories of reason and 3 categories of morality, the categorical imperatives. And the categorical imperatives are, first of all, that we should always treat people as ends in themselves. Secondly, that we should always act as though our actions are universal law. And third of all, that we should always make ethical decisions as though we are legislators in a kingdom where all people are ends in themselves. These are very noble moral precepts, and Kant, of course, is highly deontological. It's all duty-based. And the problem with it, though, and the reason why it doesn't overturn Hume, is that the reason we find these categorical imperatives appealing is they're emotionally satisfying, and there is no real logical foundation for saying that these are moral. What makes the categorical imperatives moral? So basically what Kant does is open an infinite regress and fails to provide a logical response to Hume. So basically, Hume's argument, I think, is ultimately correct that morality is not rational, it's emotional. And your textbook, and part of why I'm talking about this in detail, is that your textbook cites several studies that confirm that the emotional element of morality is what's most important, that people's ethics are largely driven by emotion. And psychologists have tested this and are finding that that's the best evidence is that that's so. Now, one more point is, in the early 20th century, a philosopher named G.E. Moore enunciated what's called the naturalistic fallacy. And he says that the naturalistic fallacy is the belief, which was stated by Hume, really, that ethical considerations can be derived from objective facts, and that such deductions are not rationally supported. So, in other words, the assumption that we are moral because we better perceive a true universe is fantasy, according to G.E. Moore and Hume. And so really what drives it is that we have certain emotions about things, and we feel strongly about something, and this makes us want to believe that we have the truth, but in fact all we have is our emotions. Now, I would say that you could make a case that some ethics is naturalistic, and the kind of argument I would make is what I kind of said about cause, that the reason we think in cause and effect is that we biologically survived because we think that way. So in other words, that nature rewards cause and effect thinking, rewards what we might consider to be rational thinking. And so what the faculties that we should develop in ourselves are the rationalistic faculties. And the reason is that they are the mechanism by which we survive. And I would say the same thing about human civilization, that the reason that ethics can be said to be naturalistic are to the extent to which they're foundational of civilization, that our civilization depends on people sharing a certain set of assumptions and values, and that if they don't share these, then civilization will fall apart. And so that's what makes them ethical. Now, you could say, well, you're just doing an infinite regress too, and you're right. So in other words, what makes it desirable to have civilization? There are people who don't like civilization. There are people who say, well, we should end civilization and go back to being cavemen. In fact, I think that there are increasing numbers of people who say that, including a lot of elite academics. The trouble with that is that I've never seen anyone, well, I'll withdraw that, but I haven't seen those people do what Henry David Thoreau did and say, I'm going to give up civilization and live on my own. I'm not saying there's no such thing as hermits who do that, but they're very rare. And the benefits of civilization, to me, are so overwhelmingly advantageous that anyone who thinks that they're going to do away with civilization is foolish. That they're going to go back to being cavemen and live the kind of life that those cavemen did. I think that's, it's just not a realistic thing. It's a fantasy. So I'll end the discussion on that. And we didn't really have time to do Rashomon, so I'll do it. We'll do that in the next session. And basically, have a nice weekend. Your discussion board was due last night, but a couple of people may have not gotten to it, so try to get to it. I'm not going to grade it until probably Thursday. I'm going to my house upstate today. I haven't been all winter, and we're going to open up the house now. So basically, have a nice weekend, and next time we're going to discuss Rashomon, and with any remaining time, get to the next material.
All right, thanks, Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank
Have a
you,
good one.
Professor.
Weekend.
Take care. See
Thank
you
you.
next time.
Thank you, Professor. Have a wonderful weekend.
Okay, Raquel came late.
Yes, I did.
Okay. See you next
Sorry
time.
about that.
No
Thank you,
problem.
Professor.
Any questions by anybody? Okay, I'm going to end the discussion and have a nice weekend.